Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to be doing my August wrap-up. So we are going to talk about everything that I read and DNF'd in the month of August. And since that is 13 things, we are going to jump right in with the very first things that I finished, which were Diamond Fire, Sapphire Flames, and Emerald Blaze, all by Alona Andrews. This is books 3.5, 4, and 5 in the Hidden Legacies series, which is an adult urban fantasy paranormal romance kind of series. And it's a really interesting world where basically 150 years ago, there was this serum that a bunch of people took, and there were 3 different possible results. The first was that you died. The second was that you turned into a monster, and then you died. And the third one was that you became a magic user. And this magic user is actually this magic using ability is actually genetic, so you can pass it on to your children. And so fast forward 150 years, what would the world look like if this had actually happened 150 years ago? Which is fascinating. So we're going to start with talking about Diamond Fire, which is a novella that bridges the first trilogy to the second trilogy. Essentially, the first trilogy follows Nevada as the main character, and the second trilogy follows her younger sister, Catalina. And so this serves as like that transition, that passing off of main character. So it does, in this book, it actually does start, like the first chapter or two starts from Nevada's perspective, but we do shift over to Catalina's. So basically, Nevada is getting married, and Catalina is super invested in trying to ensure that her sister gets to have the perfect wedding, but then something is stolen, and Nevada's soon-to-be mother-in-law comes to Catalina and says, can you solve this mystery on the down low so your sister doesn't freak out? And the story goes from there. And I really like this. I think that this really does a great job accomplishing what it needs to do, which is transitioning the main character to a new main character, giving us a sense of who Catalina is as a person. Like, we really get to see her in her element with investigations, and we get to see her kind of out of her element with interacting with these very powerful people, magic users, and using her own magic. And I really enjoyed that. The plot itself I loved, and of course the end, there's this big scene where a bunch of secrets are revealed, which was delicious, and I loved it so much. And this is just generally a really nice read, so I ended up giving it 4 stars. And then books 4 and 5 are the first 2 in Catalina's trilogy, and essentially in the first one, Catalina's soon-to-be best friends, mother and sister, die under mysterious circumstances, and so Catalina decides to go ahead and investigate. And then in Emerald Blaze, there is another mysterious death, this time at the site of a magical reclamation site that is called the Pit. So, you know, like, it's probably bad. And so Catalina is called upon to investigate that as well. Now, these are paranormal romance. There is a romantic arc that is like kind of the point of these books, but I will say that I also put it into urban fantasy because that those mystery storylines are just as strong. It's a really, really nice balance. The world building in this is top notch. Alona Andrews has such creative worlds and really thinks things through, so you just get these little tidbits that are fascinating. I love Catalina as the main character. She is yet another very competent female lead. Alona Andrews tends to write really competent female leads. And I actually like how Catalina was written, because sometimes some of the main characters that these authors, right, is they can feel very same. So Nevada feels very similar to Kate Daniels. However, with Catalina, I really appreciate it because how she investigates things and puts puzzle pieces together. You can see the family resemblance between her and Nevada, but like her personal problems are very different, and how she kind of approaches solving them is pretty different, which I really appreciated. I also appreciated that our love interest is not Rogan. So that is probably the thing that I don't like about the first trilogy, is actually our male lead. He's just not my favorite. Now, in this first book, Sapphire Flames, our love interest, Alessandro, is kind of Rogan-esque, but in between these books, there's clearly some kind of smackdown that happened. And so when we get to book 5, he's different. He's just a different kind of character. I generally love the plots in these. They're just really nicely done. They are very interesting, very, very engaging. There is a subplot bit that kind of comes in Sapphire Flames, and there's an explanation given that doesn't really feel right. So when you read it, if you get to something that doesn't feel quite right, especially as it relates to the family, don't worry, it's explained further in Emerald Blaze, and it makes a lot more sense. So I don't necessarily love that part of it, but overall the plots are really good, and these are just really fun reads. I just really enjoy them. I gave them 4.5 stars each. And then I finished The Mabon Feast by C.M. Niscosta. And so this is an erotic novella, and we are following our main character, who is a witch who has been recently tossed out of her coven. But she decides that she is going to let out the attic to a renter in hopes that that will help, like, make ends meet. And her new tenant is kind of a spider dude. He is half man, half spider in like a centaurish kind of way. And there is a lot of chemistry between the two. And the story goes from there. Now, I put this into the category of erotica, but it kind of very much toes the line between romance and erotica in kind of oddball ways. So, for example, the balance of the plot elements and like what we're doing was a little off. So a lot of the beginning was spent on our main character reflecting on her past and what got her kicked out of the coven. But that's kind of a weird thing to do if the point is erotica. Like, the point of the story is the sex, right? And so you're not necessarily making the emotional connection in the same way. It's just not necessary. So it's a little bit much if it were erotica, but all of that kind of build-up never fully resolved within the novella. So like you would expect if it were like a true romance. So it was kind of a weird thing that didn't really necessarily fit very well. And like where the sex was concerned, it was definitely a light touch. It was graphic, but it wasn't super graphic. It was like, it was just kind of, there was a light touch there. It could have been a lot more than what it was. There is some bondage involved in that sex. However, again, it was very light touch. It was there, but it wasn't super in your face about it. And like, so just overly, so like, just this short story novella, it didn't really feel like it knew what it wanted to be. Like, was it a romance or was it erotica? If you're like just dipping your toes into the water of erotica, this might be a nice place to start. But like, I do think that it needed some help sorting out what it wanted to be, but ultimately I still enjoyed reading it, and I found especially the back half of it to be compelling. And so I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And then after that, I finished Once Broken Faith by Shauna Maguire, which is the 10th book in the October Day series, which is an adult urban fantasy series. And we are following our main character of October Day, who is half human, half fae, and a knight in the fairy realms, and she frequently gets thrown at these weird problems to solve because she is best suited to solve them. And in this particular book, October has been voluntold that she needs to go to this conclave of kings and queens, where they will be discussing the ramifications from the events of the last book, which is part of why she has to be there, because of course she was kind of what set a lot of that stuff into motion. But one of the kings is very quickly killed, and so Toby starts investigating his murder. And the story goes from there. And this was probably one of my favorite books that's not a big reveal book. So there's not a ton of really big reveals, and it doesn't have a lot of like tying up of plot threads, but it's just a really enjoyable read. We get to watch Toby investigate this murder and like be very clear that she understands that she really doesn't have the skill set for a lot of this stuff, but then she looks at the Fae, like pureblood Fae, and she's like, but I'm like way better than them. We also get to like be involved in some of the political intrigue without having Toby have to be involved in that political intrigue, which is great because Toby does not do well with political intrigue. She does not know what she's doing. And so it's always a little sad to watch her flail. But because she was at a distance, we still got the political intrigue without it getting ruined by her. And just generally, like, especially the end, the last 100 pages especially, were really fast paced, like boom, 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 lots of stuff happening. And we finally got Toby reckoning with some aspects of her magic, which she's kind of like understood some of these aspects like at the edge of her consciousness, but really hasn't fully acknowledged what it means until now, and which I really adored watching that happen as well. So this is a great book. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And then I picked up The Verifiers by Jane Peck. And so this is an adult mystery novel, and we're following our main character of Claudia, who has recently been hired by this agency that provides a business service to people. Basically, clients come in and request that this company verify the online profiles of their potential romantic partners. And Claudia is one of those investigators. And at some point, I believe, one of the people in one of the cases that Claudia has been helping with goes missing. And so she wants to investigate it, I believe. I'm not entirely certain because I DNF'd this at page 50. There were a number of things that I just generally did not love about this book. Basically, in the beginning, within the first couple of chapters, there were actually multiple super ambiguous sentences. Like, I sat with them for a while and I still couldn't figure out what was intended with it, which I did not like. I also just generally didn't like any of the characters. Like, it was kind of a range from I don't care for them to I hate them, which is not great. And that includes Claudia herself. Claudia really kind of wants to be the main character of a mystery novel, and that makes her feel really, really young to me in a way that I just did not appreciate. Additionally, the other thing that I didn't appreciate is that, like, her job is kind of weird because, like, they'll be like, hey, go do this thing for this case, and she does, but then she does a little bit extra, and they're like, oh no, you screwed up. And you're like, okay, was this covered in training? We know she got training. We don't know how much. We don't know exactly what. And, like, you're not providing any further instructions, but I don't know, it's very strange because Claudia is acting like she doesn't know quite what to do, but then her boss acts like she should know what to do, which is a little bit of a weird dynamic that I did not necessarily appreciate. So I went ahead and DNF'd it. And then I picked up The Murders of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson. And yes, I am almost positive that I am mispronouncing the author's name. However, I still have not found how to pronounce that. So apologies. I'm pretty sure it's wrong, but I don't have any like other indication of how to pronounce it. But this is kind of a speculative horror kind of novella, adult. And in it, we're following our main character of Molly. And every time that Molly bleeds, another Molly is created. And that Molly is bent on killing our main character, Molly. So she enters a kill or be killed kind of situation. That is an absolutely fascinating premise. And I mostly enjoyed the execution. I do think that there were some issues with it. For example, the world building was not well fleshed out, and it was a kind of a weird amount of world building that we got. So there were explanations given, even like sciencey kind of explanations, but then also there was a bunch of stuff that was just kind of hand waved or not addressed at all. And so I found myself, I had a lot of questions, and it was kind of weird because it felt like it didn't know if it wanted to be like a speculative science fiction or like a speculative horror. Because if it was more science fiction, we should have gotten more explanation. But if it was horror, I think we actually got too much explanation because it invited a lot of questions. So I liked the world building we got, but it was the wrong amount. Additionally, I don't think that we really know who Molly is as a character by the end. At least I very much did not. I had like a very blurry idea of what she might be, but like we just don't have any kind of characterization really in this book. And I want to be clear, like it's only 117 pages or something. We don't have a ton of time for in-depth characterization, but it felt like we really just didn't get almost anything at all. But the really interesting part is that like even knowing that there was some issues with the world building and issues with the characterization, it was still really compelling. And like I noticed those things as I was reading, but it didn't break my enjoyment of it all. It was mostly kind of a thing where I noticed it and I was just like, oh, that's kind of sad, because if you had gotten that part of it correct, this would have been so good. But as it was, I still really enjoyed it, and I ended up giving this 4 stars. The only other thing that I want to say about this real quick is that it's kind of a content warning, that it was just really strange. Okay, so it was one of those things where there was two very brief mentions of some amount of sexual contact between our main character Molly and one of the like clone Mollys, which definitely threw me for a loop. It was really weird, but it was like very briefly touched on, and then like we moved past very quickly. But I wanted to let everybody know because again, I was not prepared for that and it was weird. And then I picked up Crown Duel and Court Duel. This is actually a bind up of the duology, and I read them both. And it is by Sherwood Smith, and it is a young adult fantasy duology. We are following our main character of Meliara, and she is the daughter of a count. And the count is dying in the first couple of pages. He's dying, but with like as he's lying there dying, he basically summons Mel and her brother and makes them promise to try to stop the king from breaking this really big, really important covenant. The count has proof. Please just stop them. Just stop him. And so Mel and her brother agree. But as soon as their dad dies, it becomes very clear they don't know how to do this because the mercenaries that they hired basically took their money and ran. They don't have money to hire more. They don't have the people to put together an army. And even if what people they have no training, but they're still determined to try to stop this king from breaking that covenant. And the story goes from there. And this was really interesting because this was my childhood favorite. It was one of my childhood favorites. And so I've reread this so many times, but this is probably the first time in like 10 years that I've picked this book up. And what I found was that the first one, Crown Duel, is generally just not the kind of story that I like anyway. I think that it's fine. It's like armies clashing, like an army clashing with like a ragtag group, okay? It's not my favorite kind of story. It's not bad, it's just not my favorite. But because I had read it so many times, I knew all the plot beats, and instead of like finding comfort from that familiarity, I was just bored, which was really unfortunate. And part of that was because I had read it so many times and it's not my favorite kind of story, but some of it was also because our main character of Mel just is such a young adult. She's such a teenager. She is brash and she is stubborn and she jumps to the wrong conclusions and then like it really struggles to change her perception of things. And I was just like, oh, you are like not my favorite. Like this is the kind of young adult character that I really struggle with. And I want to be clear, it's not because teenagers aren't like that. They definitely are. It's very realistic, but it's because I have an 11-year-old who is starting to do some of those things. And so like I read to escape reality, and it's a little bit harder to escape reality when the main character is a little bit reminiscent of my child. So I did really struggle with that. However, at the end of book one, Mel does actually like acknowledge in the text that she's not the greatest. She acknowledges that she's naive and she's stubborn and she's been jumping to the wrong conclusions and all of that stuff, and she makes concrete steps to correct that. So when we get into book two, she is actively trying to work on it, and it doesn't mean that she's like perfect, but she is significantly better and a character that I enjoy significantly more. And number two actually is the right kind of book. It's a political intrigue book. And so we get to watch Mel navigate these political situations with varying levels of success. And I really, really enjoyed that. And because it's YA, we didn't have super complicated plots. And so it moved very, very fast, which is both pluses and minus, right? Plus and minus. Because it moved so fast, we didn't get bogged down in all these details that you sometimes get with political intrigue kind of books. Like, it just slows it down so much that you're just like, oh my God, just keep going. But because it's YA and it's not super complicated, it feels a little bit simplistic at times. And you're just like, okay, I mean, sure. It was in some ways really nice, in some ways not my favorite. But what I will say that I think at this point, at least the second book is probably one of my favorite YA fantasy books. So not necessarily one of my favorite fantasy books, but definitely one of my favorite YA fantasy books. So I gave the first book, Crown Duel, 3.5 stars, and I gave the second book, Court Duel, 4.5 stars. And then I picked up Seven of Infinities by Aliette de Bodard, and this is a Shuya universe novella. Really broadly, the Shuya universe is essentially probably thousands of years in the future. We are like super in space, heavily influenced by Vietnamese culture, and there are mind ships, like literally brains inside and running these huge spaceships. In this particular one, we are following our main character of Van, who is a teacher, and she gets a visit from a mind ship at the same time that her student gets a visitor from an older woman. And they aren't, neither of them are particularly far into their visits before the woman dies, and Van and the mind ship Sunless Woods decide to investigate, and the story goes from there. I love the Shuya universe, and like every book that I read that is in this universe, makes me enjoy it so much more. And I think that this is actually one of the better places to start. It still does not explain a ton about the world building, but it does touch on enough that I think that you can follow it a little bit more easily than you can in other books. And in this one, I really enjoyed the interplay of all the various relationships. Van and her student, Van and Sunless Woods, the mind ship, Sunless Woods and her crew, the people that are involved with this death of the woman. I mean, it's just really, really interesting. And that had me super invested in this novella. And I especially loved the relationship between Van and her student and Van and Sunless Woods, which was great because when we got to the ending, it was so satisfying for those relationship reasons. Watching those relationships play out on the page and grow. It was great. The plot itself, however, was convoluted. And honestly, like I don't think that there were parts that I was just like, I don't think that I'm understanding what is happening, which is not great. It was okay. I still got big picture, and I was so invested in the relationships that it didn't bother me so much that like I knew I was missing little bits of the plot, but that is something to note, that the plot is a bit convoluted. But overall, I still really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4.25 stars. And then I picked up Acorn Cove by Kay O'Neill. And this is a kid's graphic novel where we're following our main character who is returning to Acorn Cove, where she used to live with her mom and dad. But years some number of years ago, there was a big storm that killed her mother, and she and her father moved away. And they are returning for reasons that I don't actually remember. And obviously now our main character is going to have to deal with her grief. There is another plot line that is a little bit more like eco-friendly, like we have to learn to live with nature and not to take too much, which is just as important. But it's very clear that this book was intended to be like a kid dealing with her grief over the death of her mother. Kay O'Neill has a very specific illustration style that I really appreciate, especially in a kid's graphic novel. It was seen here. It was great. I really appreciated the illustrations of this. I also think that the author does a pretty good job handling some of these rougher topics. It is really rough to talk about, like, losing your parent when you are so young. And they do it with a pretty light touch. Now, occasionally some of that messaging does get pretty pointed, but you kind of expect that a little bit from a kid's graphic novel, because you want to make sure that the kids get the point. But unfortunately, like, it did make me lose a little bit of my enjoyment, because I was just like, yes, I know. But since I'm not the intended audience, it's okay. And just generally overall, the story was nice. It was very simplistic because it is a kid's graphic novel, but it was just kind of a nice story. And I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And then I picked up Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. And this is an adult novella, and we're following our main character of Esther, who decides to run away and join the librarians. And because the librarians have a very interesting life where they ride around their territory and distribute approved materials to the local folks. And as Esther rides with them, she realizes that maybe that's not all that they do, and the story goes from there. This I generally really liked, but there was a major problem which ended up affecting my rating of this. Let's get into it. So this has a very Western feel to it, which I don't always get on with because I don't love Westerns, but I really liked it in this book. I think it was done pretty well. I didn't necessarily like any of the characters, but I did really enjoy watching the characters interact, which is pretty good. I really enjoy that. And so I was maybe not rooting for them all the time, but I was enjoying watching them. There is not a ton of world building in this, which is pretty understandable because it's not very long. It's a novella. But the world building we got gave me glimpses into this world that just made me so interested to see more. Additionally, there are multiple things in here that are maybe not quite what they seem at first glance, and I found all of that to be fascinating. However, so I really liked the ideas of the plot, but I didn't like the execution, because there were 2 major plot points that are necessary. We had to do it to move the plot along, that you can't look at for too long before it stops making sense, which is not good. Basically, for example, the first one, there was one of our characters was asked to do something. She refused for no apparent reason that we can tell. And she did that knowing the consequences were probably going to be that they were going to get into a firefight with some people. And that firefight needed to happen for plot reasons, but it was just there was no reason for her to not do what she was asked to do. So it was just one of those why are you doing this? I don't understand your motivations at all. I can kind of come up with something that might work, but no, we needed more explanation there. And there was a second plot point that was just as bad. And so I really enjoyed this as I was reading it, but as I was explaining to my husband what I had read after I had finished it, I was just oh. And now I'm noticing that that I can easily poke holes in this plot. So I ended up dropping my rating because of that, and I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. And then lastly, I did pick up The Tropic of Serpents by Marie Brennan, which is the second book in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, which is an adult fantasy series where we are following our main character of Isabella Camhurst as she is on her journey to become a world-renowned dragon naturalist. Now, this is written to be a memoir. It's fictional, but it is like written in the style of a memoir. So our narrator is Isabella Camhurst, later known as Lady Trent, and she is looking back on these exploits. And I love this framing device. Like, I love Lady Trent's voice and her narration of these events. So that was so perfect for me. The plot was interesting because, like, when Isabella was being a scientist and like learning more about dragons and finding this stuff out and like doing really stupid things to try to like learn more about the dragons and like thinking the consequences through of some of her data and some of that kind of thing, I loved it. Loved every bit of Isabella being a scientist. I didn't necessarily love the political intrigue, and I didn't necessarily love her interactions with the locals. Like, it wasn't bad, it just wasn't it for me. And so like I loved all the naturalist stuff, and I really enjoyed that part, but like everything else didn't work as well for me. It was well written, it just wasn't for me. In this one, there is also some serious character development, which was so interesting to see, and I am really intrigued to see how Isabella goes forward, especially with Tom and Natalie, where she did have some of these big relationship development things. The only major issue that I have with this is that it's written in a style that is reminiscent of like Victorian writing. This is definitely a very different world, but it kind of maps similarly to like a Victorian period. So this feels more like historical, which is really interesting, because it's not our world. And so the writing is in that Victorian-esque kind of style, which I don't generally get on with. This one, it didn't take me as long to get into the flow of it, but it still is not my favorite. But I still really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4.25 stars. So that is it. That is everything that I read and DNF'd in the month of August. If you have any thoughts or feelings about any of the books that I read, please leave me a comment down below. But that is it. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, and until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!